Bonjour, hello, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Daniel Bélan, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, live, and study, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. I want to note before we begin that today's lecture is being recorded. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. There will be a moderated Q&A period following Dr. Popova's lecture, and you are welcome to submit your questions at any time during or immediately after the talk. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. We're also interested in the role and the place of Canada in the world. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as the talk that you will just hear in a few minutes from now. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Maria Popova. Professor Maria Popova is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University, where she holds the Jean Monnet Chair, Europe and the Rule of Law. She specializes in comparative politics, European politics, and post-communist transformation, courts, and politics. She has studied extensively Russia and especially Ukraine. And today it's the first anniversary of the beginning of the attempted Russian invasion of Russia. So we are really glad to have her with us today to present this lecture titled The Russo-Ukrainian War a Year Later. Maria, it's all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I will share my screen in order to I have some slides just to guide me and for you to see what I'm planning to cover today. And okay, do you see my slides? I hope so. Okay.
Yes.
So perfect. I'll actually start by pointing out that the war didn't, in fact, start in 2022. We talk a lot about the first year anniversary, but it's really the first year anniversary of the full-scale attempted invasion. In reality, Russian military aggression against Ukraine started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and also with Russia jump-starting a proxy war in eastern Ukraine by backing, recruiting and backing separatists in eastern Ukraine. So Russia has been waging war on Ukraine really for 9 years now. The 2014 invasion of Crimea also started in February. So it's a double anniversary of sorts. And I wanted to start by saying sort of what are some of the things that we already knew back in February of 2022. I mean, we knew even back then that Russia's goal was not Ukraine's neutrality, even though that was an argument that Russia tried to make in the failed diplomatic efforts in the winter, in the fall of 21 and winter of 22. It was also, we already knew back then that this war was not about protecting Russian speakers in Donbass, because Russia had already controlled Donbass de facto for 8 years. If they wanted to take over all of Donbass, they could have started the war from there, and they didn't. They started the war with a run on Kyiv. So we knew even back then that the overarching goal of this invasion was to establish political control over Ukraine, over the central government, over the entire country. Over the past year, we've seen Russia work towards this goal, fortunately, unsuccessfully so far. So the other thing that we also knew in February was that Ukrainians were dedicated, were committed to defending their statehood. We knew that Ukrainians would resist. The Russians apparently thought that Ukrainians would greet them like liberators, but in fact, anybody who had been working on Ukrainian politics, anyone who had visited Ukraine in the last few years before this invasion knew that Ukrainians were in fact highly committed to keeping their independent statehood. Polls in the run-up to the invasion showed that Ukrainians were ready to pick up arms to defend their country, to volunteer for the armed services, to volunteer for territorial defense units, to defend their own cities and villages, to volunteer for civil society organizations to support the war effort. This was not a surprise. But what we have learned over the past year are there's several things that we did not really expect and we didn't really predict well and didn't really see coming in some ways back in February of 2022. The first thing is we didn't quite have a good sense of how maximalist Russia's goals really were in this war. It was clear that Russia was going to attempt to replace the democratically elected Ukrainian president with a Russian puppet. That's what intelligence services were saying in the run-up to the war, but we didn't quite realize, so Russia was going for a regime change, that much was clear, but we didn't realize that Russia's goals were even more maximalist than that. It was not only about establishing political control over the Ukrainian government by replacing it with a puppet, but really conquering all of Ukraine and also destroying the Ukrainian political nation. Now, this is something that we have found out over the past year, or rather there was a lot of reasons why we may have forecasted it, but now we have evidence that this is Russia's goal. And what is this evidence? We see Russia not only annexing Ukrainian territory, claiming that it is now Russia and it is part of Russia. Obviously, the goal is annexing all of Ukraine. They just haven't managed to control more territory than some parts of the south and the east. But the idea is to deny that a separate Ukrainian state has a right to exist. So that's a very maximalist goal. We see that they're aiming in the territories that they do control militarily. They're really going on a campaign to try to destroy the Ukrainian political nation. So what do I mean by that? It is not about exterminating every ethnic Ukrainian, but it is about exterminating the idea of a Ukrainian political nation as separate from the Russian nation. The idea that anybody who believes that a Ukrainian nation separate from Russia exists is a Nazi, is brainwashed by the West or used by the West, that this is an artificial construct that should not exist. Russia has been very clear that this is their position and this is what they're going after. And we have a lot of evidence for this. We have massive deportations and kidnappings of Ukrainian citizens, especially Ukrainian children, who are then adopted in Russia, and their identity is actively changed to a Russian identity. Now, this under the genocide definition falls squarely under it. When you try to change the identity of children of a given nation, you're basically trying to wipe out that nation. And this is what Russia has been openly doing. It has admitted, in fact, it is proud of the fact that it is taking Ukrainian children, putting them in re-education camps, telling them that they're actually Russian, and then adopting them into Russian families. They have been actively doing this, and Ukraine is trying to win this war in order to get its children back. We also have now really conclusive evidence that Russia is not motivated by a fear of NATO in this war, but it is actually motivated by a refusal to let Ukraine determine its own geopolitical course. And the reason we know that this is not motivated by a fear of NATO is that as Russia has been waging this war in Ukraine, it has left its border with with NATO members. Ukraine is not a NATO member. That's the first point. But Russia has left its vast, already existing border with NATO states unprotected. It has literally pulled troops away from its borders with NATO and it has put these troops in Ukraine. So clearly, Russia is not actually concerned about an invasion of its territory coming from NATO. It also did not strenuously object to new NATO members joining when Sweden and Finland announced that as a result of Russian aggression, they would like to join NATO to protect themselves as well. Russia basically said that that is, they're not welcoming this development, of course, but this is okay. And it is not a major threat to Russia because Ukraine is special. And that tells you that this is really not about a threat of coming from NATO, not about encirclement. It is about a motivation about that the Russian elites have right now to attempt to restore what they see as the restoration of Russian domination over Ukraine. Now, we also have seen, and we've learned over the past year, something that we didn't actually know for sure, that Russian forces and the Russian leadership reacts actually rationally to defeat on the battlefield. In the beginning of the war, when Putin started this war by really delivering quite a few veiled nuclear threats, things along the lines of nobody should dare try to stop us, because the implication was we will escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. In the beginning of the war, this was even though still perceived as sort of a long shot, it was a somewhat credible threat because, yes, Russia is a nuclear power, and who knows, maybe the Russian president and the Russian leadership were motivated so much to win this war that they would be willing to escalate through to a nuclear level. In the beginning of February, this was a more likely occurrence and a more well-founded fear than it is today, because we've seen that Russia has reacted to several defeats on the battlefield in Ukraine by rationally revising its military goals. It has retreated from places that it couldn't control, like in Kherson, for example. It retreated, even though it now claims to have annexed Kherson. And what that means is that they claim that this is Russian territory, yet they retreated from it when they were pushed militarily. And it turned out that this was not a nuclear red line in any way. So the longer this war has gone on, and the more defeats Russia has suffered on the battlefield, and the more times we've seen them rationally retreat, is an indication that the nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear escalation, is more and more far-fetched. I mean, we should never discount it completely, because this horrible possibility is always there in the background, but now we have a bit more confidence that this is not where the Russian leadership will immediately go in case of defeat. We've also found out a lot of things about Ukraine in the past war, in the past year of the full-scale invasion, or as some Ukrainians have been calling it, the year of full-scale resistance. And what we've seen in that year is that the Ukrainian army is much stronger than people expected. People were expecting the Ukrainian army to put up some fight, but to not last against the mighty Russian army for more than a few days, Russia thought, or even a few weeks. Maybe some of the optimists in the West thought, but clearly the thinking back in February was that the Ukrainian army cannot withstand an assault of this magnitude by the Russian army. We've seen, in fact, that the Ukrainian army is much better trained, much better organized. It does not, its logistics lines work way better than the Russian ones, and it is capable of achieving real results on the battlefield. Even in the beginning of the war, when military assistance to Ukraine was actually minimal, because the West did not, in fact, supply Ukraine with significant weapons in the run-up to this war. So when in late February and early March, Ukraine was entirely on its own militarily, they managed to repel the invasion of Kyiv. And that was a significant military victory that the Ukrainian army achieved without significant military aid from the West. It's you might remember in the early days of the invasion, when the media was constantly talking about the 40-kilometer convoy that was headed on Kyiv. Well, the Ukrainian army stopped that. And so as it's received more military aid from the West in the last year, it has achieved more successes on the battlefields, two successful counteroffensives in the east and in the south. But the point is that the Ukrainian army has managed to make the most of the weapons that it is receiving. It has been well organized. And not suffering from the corruption problems that the Russian army has been suffering from. So that's one thing we found out. We also found out that Ukrainian state institutions work much better than what the common narrative about a weak Ukrainian state plagued by corruption would have predicted. In fact, we've seen that Ukrainian state capacity is significant, for example, the Ukrainian state has managed to continue functioning under assault. We've seen many inspiring examples of that. You see that in the liberated territories, where Ukraine has managed to push away the Russian invasion. Roads have been quickly rebuilt, trains start running again. When Russia in the fall started attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, targeting the power grid, the Ukrainian state worked around the clock to try to mitigate the problems for the population by creating invincibility centers where people could go and stay warm and charge their devices and survive in some cases. So that was something that the Ukrainian state organized very quickly. They also managed to organize the repairs to the power grid very quickly, to the point that today, a couple of months after, or rather a couple of months into the attacks on the Ukrainian power grid by Russia, the Ukrainian state has managed to maintain the capacity and to put the lights back on, so to speak, for the Ukrainian people. And that is something that we maybe did not see coming. We did not see that Ukrainian state institutions would be so resilient and would function so well under stress. We also saw, of course, civil society support the state. This year, we see the beginning of strong cooperation between the state and civil society, because in the last few years, we already knew that Ukrainian civil society is well developed. There are volunteer networks, but usually these volunteer networks were put in place in order to challenge the state, in order to constrain the state from encroaching on civil rights. The roots of Ukrainian civil society come from civil society challenging attempts at authoritarian tendencies by the Ukrainian government in the early 2000s and in 2012, 2014, in the run-up to the Euromaidan protests. So the roots of Ukrainian civil society are in protest and in constraining the state. But over the last year, we've seen that now this relationship has been transformed into Ukrainian civil society working together with the state to now repel the Russian invasion. We've also learned some things about the West and about its role in supporting Ukraine in this war. For example, we've learned that arming Ukraine earlier might have deterred Russia from launching this full-scale invasion in the first place. That in fact, treading carefully and trying to continue engagement with Russia only sent a signal of weakness to Russia. It only sent a signal that the West is really not that invested, not that interested in protecting Ukraine. So Ukraine is up for the taking. So deterrence failed because the Western allies were too cautious and decided not to arm Ukraine in the run-up to this war. That's something that we found out in the past year. We've also found out, however, that European economies are much more resilient themselves and do not actually need continued engagement with Russia through trade, and especially through energy trade. In the summer, as it became clearer and clearer that Russia was going to use its energy exports as a weapon against the West, it became increasingly clear that it will try to blackmail the West into dropping support for Ukraine in exchange for continuing energy trade. There was a lot of concern that Europe is already dependent on Russian energy. It cannot break this relationship without suffering significant consequences in the economic realm. It turns out, however, over the past 6 months, we've learned that the European economies are much more resilient than that. Germany reduced its dependence on or eliminated its dependence on Russian energy, and its economy did not suffer significant consequences. not only Germany, but some of the poorer European countries. Bulgaria, for example, which is the poorest EU member, also weaned itself completely from Russian energy and did not suffer enormous economic consequences. In fact, that energy transition was quite smooth and even potentially in Bulgaria's long-term interests in terms of pricing. What has happened in effect is that Russia committed energy suicide in Europe, as Thane Gustafsson, who is a long-term specialist on Russian energy, put it so eloquently. Russia basically, in order to blackmail Europe, killed its energy exports to Europe, but why is this a suicide rather than a temporary change? Because Europe really heard the message that Russia is using energy as a weapon, and therefore it is not in Europe's interest to restart this energy relationship after the war is over. So the energy relationship is probably over long term. So where do we go from here? I will very briefly discuss, because it's much harder to talk about the future than it is about the past year. In hindsight, is much easier to see things clearly. But one of the things that we can say about the future is that the most likely solution to this war is a military solution rather than a negotiated settlement. And this is because really the goals of the two parties are fundamentally irreconcilable. Russia wants to conquer and control all of Ukraine, not just take some part of it, not just incorporate some regions. The goal is to take over all of Ukraine. And Ukraine is committed to its independence. An overwhelming majority wants to continue fighting to victory. In fact, Ukrainians are so united in this goal to persevere as an independent nation that polls are showing that over 90% of Ukrainians would support continuing to fight, even if Russia uses a nuclear weapon. Now, this is really serious commitment. And the seriousness of this commitment is because this is an existential issue for Ukraine. It either exists as an independent state or it doesn't. So the calls for peace negotiations are really not credible right now unless we have some sort of plan on how to convince the Russian regime to give up on the goal of controlling Ukraine. Now, this may happen only if there is fundamental change within Russia, but that is not necessarily on the horizon either. So it is really quite unlikely that Russia would quickly accept that it has lost control of Ukraine. So even if it's pushed out of Ukrainian territory altogether, it will still be motivated to try again to have another run at taking Ukraine. As a result of that, as long as Russia's regime holds on to this view that Ukraine belongs to Russia, Ukraine and its allies will have to contain Russia to prevent renewed aggression. So the idea here is that it is not realistic right now to try to change Russia's goals. It is only realistic to change the calculus for Russia about the costs that would be that it would incur from pursuing these goals. That's the part that Ukraine can affect, and with allied help, it can also send a stronger message. So in order to send this message to Russia that Ukraine is no longer up for grabs and cannot be pushed off its chosen path of European integration. One of the things that has to happen after this war is over, or it has to continue, this process has to continue as the war, even if the war is not over yet, is that Ukraine has to be integrated into Western institutions in order to send this clear message to Russia that Ukraine has left its geopolitical orbit permanently and will be integrating into Europe. This is a crucial step that is needed in order to achieve lasting peace, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe as well, because if Russia succeeds in some way, even partially, in establishing control over Ukraine, it will take away the message that at a later date it can try again. It can try for another part of Ukraine, or it can try for other parts of the former Soviet Union, Moldova, for example, even the Baltics. The more successes Russia draws from this military aggression aimed at restoration, the more emboldened Russia would be. And that's why it's important that Ukraine win this war. And I'll end here and take your questions.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, please, for our viewers, please write down your questions in the actual Q&A box. And I will start with a few questions for you directly, Maria, about Canada, the role of Canada in this, this geopolitical conflict. How would you grade Canada's handling of this situation in terms of foreign policy, in terms of military aid and humanitarian aid, and in terms of also the handling and the taking care of Ukrainian refugees? I mean, Canada has 4% of its population claiming to have at least partial Ukrainian descent background. So this is important for many Canadians, regardless of whether they are of Ukrainian descent or not. So how would you overall assess Canada's role in that, that major international crisis?
So I think Canada has done a good job overall. It is a reliable ally to Ukraine. It has been always committed to Ukrainian independence. So Canada has always been on the right side of history on this issue. Now, where I would say Canada needs to work more in order to be a more effective supporter of Ukraine is on its military budget. So basically, Canada has bigger motivation and ideas and bigger commitment to helping than capacity. And that is where we would have to have a conversation within Canada about how we want to build up this capacity, to what extent we want to build up this capacity, and how we can assist more and participate more, step up more within NATO. Within NATO, we're not among the countries that are leading on the military aid front. On the diplomatic front, though, I would say I would give higher marks. Canada has done a good job communicating that Ukraine should win this war. For example, in the OSCE, right now this week, there's been a big controversy because the Russian delegation is there. It cannot be excluded because of the formal rules, but the presence of the Russian Federation at this meeting really makes a mockery of the mission of the OSCE as an organization. So different countries have taken different approaches on how to deal with this diplomatically. In the Baltics, Lithuania, for example, decided not to participate at all in this meeting in a show of protest. And Canada has been among the few countries that is meeting on the side. So it's Canada, it's the Baltics, Poland, and they're meeting on the side, and they're trying France and the UK, I think also, they're meeting on the side to try, as strong supporters of Ukraine, to try to figure out diplomatically how to effectively isolate Russia within the organization and send a clear message that its aggression will not be just accepted. So I think Canada has a strong commitment to being on the right side, but there has to be a bit more effort maybe on the military assistance side.
Thank you. We already have some questions here that I will read, but I encourage again our viewers to write down their questions because we are collecting them as we speak. I have some follow-up questions for you, but we'll start with the questions from the attendees here. Actually, we're talking about Canada, you know, and what Canada has done, and you talk a lot about the European Union and so forth. Now I want to bring the role of China here with the question that we have. Of course, we know about China and how contentious its potential support for Russia is and so forth. But here's a more specific question. So the Chinese government just released a 12-point peace plan. How can this move impact the war? And how is it important from a geopolitical point of view? And I will add beyond even this thing, you know, what's the role of China here? Because China is, of course, now really a superpower economically and even militarily. And of course, it's under pressure from the US and other countries like Canada to not help Russia in any way. But of course, that's not what's happening now. So what's your take on the role of Russia? And if you have any comment about this specific peace plan, quote unquote, of course, you can also discuss that.
Yeah, the role of China is really quite an important factor here. And in the beginning of the war, unfortunately, I think things have deteriorated on this front rather than improved. In the beginning of the war, there was some hope that China is uncomfortable with this military aggression, that it prefers economic competition to military competition, and as a result is deeply uncomfortable by this obvious Russian aggression against Ukraine, so it would moderate or try to stop. But it seems that in more recent in the last month or so, China has actually perhaps calculated that Russia is really losing, and that's also not what China wants. China wants the West to be weakened, not Russia to be completely decimated by this war on the battlefield. So the reports that China might be considering military aid to Russia are deeply concerning because this really can prolong the war significantly. And so I'm more concerned rather than less concerned about the Chinese role. And on the peace plan specifically, I think, as you said, it has to be put in quotes because China does not have the credibility to present itself as a neutral actor in order to be a mediator. It is trying to do that, but that's not credible because it has consistently abstained in the UN, which is tacit approval for Russia's aggression. It has constantly peddled the argument that Russia has legitimate security concerns vis-a-vis NATO, which has been shown not to be a credible argument. So that erodes China's credibility as a potential mediator here. So a peace plan from China is not likely to be taken seriously. It's sort of like Roger Waters' attempt to be neutral at the UN while repeating Russian talking points. It's not a credible attempt.
Thank you. So we have another question here, And this one is about the role of the United States, which is, of course, very important here. So we move from China to the US. The United States will be holding presidential elections soon. Well, yes, in 2024. If a candidate who is against American support for Ukraine wins, I suppose someone like Donald Trump, how do you think this will affect the outcome of the war? So that's a bit looking at your crystal ball, but maybe reflecting a bit on what's happening within the United States in terms of domestic politics and how this might impact foreign policy towards Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, this is a crucial point because indeed, at this point, the US being the greatest military power is providing the most aid. It has provided significant aid that allows Ukraine to recapture some of its territories and to stay in play, so to speak, in this war. So if American support is withdrawn, it will have very grave consequences for the Ukrainian war effort. There's no doubt about that. But I think there are two things to consider here. The first is that we're not seeing, in fact, evidence of war fatigue among the American public, in the sense of people who were previously highly supportive of Ukraine are now kind of losing interest in this war, and that's why not supporting. They want to move on to some other issue. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a bit of a polarization. We're seeing some factions within the Republican Party make the argument that supporting Ukraine is just not in the US's interest. And that's why what we're seeing is increasing numbers of people against aid. But in fact, the support for aid is still majority. And this challenge domestically comes from within the Republican Party only, or mostly, and is not a Republican versus Democrat issue, but rather Republicans versus other Republicans disagreeing on this. So yes, the 2024 American election will be hugely consequential, but I think there are a number of ways that this could play out, and we don't know at this point that even the Republican Party would be against, as a whole, would be against aid to Ukraine. It's only a faction within them that's pushing that position.
Thank you. We have another question here that is more about the timing of the invasion, the attempted invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, a year ago, but also in 2014. So is it a coincidence that the invasions of 2014 and 2022 were launched in February, or is there a political logistic reason for this, or is it just fortuitous, like just random?
The 2014 invasion was entirely opportunistic on Russia's part. So it's unlikely that it was planned long before. It had to do with the fact that Russia really refused to accept that Ukraine had a government change through domestic forces. It refused to accept that Ukraine would be moving towards a pro-Western policy course by virtue of that change, and used the fact that the Ukrainian state at the time was significantly weakened by the prolonged protest and by disagreements within Ukraine. Russia used that opportunity to seize parts of Ukraine very quickly with very little resistance. So that explains the timing there. They just had to move on quickly if they wanted to do this. Now, why in February of 2022? That also, I think, has less to do with the time of the year, more to do with the fact that starting in 21, Putin had decided that he is going to try to push the West to deliver Ukraine politically to Russia. That's why he started with by amassing these troops. But he was probably hoping to avoid war. He was probably hoping to achieve this diplomatically. How? By basically getting assurances from the West that Ukraine will be delivered politically, that its desired European integration would be cut off, and it would be pushed to basically to submit to Russian demands on a variety of questions, which had to do with really establishing control politically over Ukraine. Now, when he couldn't achieve this diplomatically, when that diplomatic effort failed, he ended up launching this full-scale invasion, in part because he thought it would be very quick again, like Crimea. So there might be some symbolism there, doing it in February, also doing it right after the end of Olympic Games. Putin is known to be quite superstitious and kind of believer in supernatural things. So there might be some symbolism there in the date, but not an actual logistics argument for it.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about a major neighbor of, actually we have two questions. So let's take them together, and then I will have my final question for you. So I will ask you two questions from the audience. Now it's too late to write more questions, but we'll take these two questions because they are excellent questions, and then I will ask you my last question. So Belarus, do you see Belarus joining in the war effort? I mean, in a direct way, I suppose, more direct way. We are reading about Russian military buildup in Belarus, but is there sufficient citizen opposition to keep Belarus from entering the conflict in such a direct way? Second question, another excellent question. You mentioned that long-term peace depends on Ukraine's military resistance and that regime change in Russia is unlikely. Do you think that the military failures of Russia increase the chance of regime change, given the constant, blatant discrepancy between great promises and actual performance on the ground, making the regime seem like a lame duck? Or does the war help consolidate the regime because it gives an opportunity to the regime to crack down on dissent even more than before, and so to increase domestic control over its population? So two excellent questions, big questions, especially the second one, but I'm curious to hear your answers.
Indeed, these are great, important questions. On Belarus, I'll be quicker. Indeed, Russia has used Belarus as sort of a launching pad for this war effort from the very start. But Lukashenko has also kind of tried to resist entering the war fully through troops, probably because he realizes that his position in Belarus might be threatened if he commits Belarusian troops to invade Ukraine. There are actually volunteers from Belarus fighting on Ukraine's side, a lot of them. So this will be politically costly for him. He mostly realizes, and the reason why this doesn't resonate with Belarus, even though Belarus is also an authoritarian regime like Russia. So why doesn't this war resonate as well with Belarusian society? Well, because it is very much a Russian imperial war. It's about restoring Russian control over Ukraine that in some ways is marginal to what Belarus is interested in. So I think it's likely that Belarus will continue sort of treading carefully here and yes, helping the Russian war effort significantly, but not going all in. Now, the Russian regime change question is hugely important, and it is what I have in mind. Yes, so as the defeats on the battlefield grow, this does destabilize the Russian regime because it looks weak, and Putin's appeal has always been strength. So the weaker he looks is threatening to him. But I think what we need to understand is that the Russian regime has a lot of leeway in this war, not because the war allows the Russian regime to repress, but because the war fundamentally resonates with a big chunk of Russian society for historical reasons. In other words, even though Russian society is not committed to an existential war and not, launching volunteer battalions to go fight in Ukraine, and not going enthusiastically to the mobilization centers, that is not the case. But there is kind of a wide understanding among the majority that Russia is entitled to control Ukraine somehow, that it's only right that Russia reestablish this control. So in fact, what Russian sociologists themselves have pointed out is that one of the reasons we don't see a significant or rather one of the main reasons we don't see a significant anti-war movement form in Russia is not necessarily repression, state repression, which there is a lot of, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is, in fact, social pressure on people to conform, to follow what the regime is doing, and to stay in line, basically. And this doesn't mean that that if Putin dies tomorrow, the next Russian leader will necessarily want to continue the war. They may have a slightly different calculation about how to do things, but what it means is that Russian society is likely to follow what the elites do rather than significantly shape what the regime does. There are polls that show quite convincingly, done through very different methods to try to control for the element of repression, which is of course significant, that show that if you're asked, do you want the war, do you want Russia to attempt taking Kyiv again? A majority says yes. Then they're asked, do you want to sign a peace treaty tomorrow and withdraw? Again, a majority says yes, because the point is, whatever the government decides, the government knows better, and we will just follow. So I think that that is a big, I think what that tells us is that we need to really be spending less time sort of trying to figure out what Russian society may want or not, and more time on the elites, because this is what's going to determine the trajectory.
Thank you. So the last question, it's a big one too. We talk about the future of Russia and the Putin regime. Let's talk about the future of Ukraine. What you said in your presentation, I think is consistent with the idea that's widely shared now, that the Ukrainian state, that its institutions and civil society, are stronger than what many people believe before the beginning of the Russian invasion, including what the Putin regime, I think, believed. This is very much a David against Goliath fight, but so far, of course, Ukraine has been able to defend itself very strongly with the help of the international community, most of the international community, at least the West. So if Ukraine, say, finds a way to, and with its allies, find a way to repel the Russian invaders, or at least that, most of the Ukrainian territory, including Kyiv, remains under Ukrainian control, what do you think is the future of Ukraine as a polity, as a political system, and as a society?
That's a crucial question. And I think however this war ends, in order to have lasting peace in Europe, what has to happen is a clear geopolitical recategorization of Ukraine, from belonging to some sort of invisible Russian sphere of influence to European integration. It doesn't mean or Euro-Atlantic integration. It doesn't mean that Ukraine has to join the EU and NATO immediately, formally, but it means that there has to be wide understanding, both in the West and in Russia, that Ukraine is now working towards becoming part of the West. And this process will not be stopped. This process is a process that Ukrainian society has committed to. At this point, Ukrainians are hugely united in that this is their national goal. 80–90% of Ukrainians say that they want to be both in the EU and in NATO. This is their goal, and so the future of Ukraine is working towards that goal, continuing reforms, which it started back in 2014 in order to make this possible, but also the understanding in both Russia and the West that this recategorization is happening, because that's something that Russia wanted to prevent for sure, but it's also something that the West was not fully committed to before this war, not fully internalized within the West either. I mean, a lot of people in the West saw Ukraine as some kind of buffer zone, some kind of in-between. That's why there was all this discussion of neutrality. What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is that both Ukrainians don't want it, and Russia is not enough for Russia. I mean, that's the problem, fundamentally, that Russia was not satisfied with this neutral position. It wanted Ukraine fully incorporated in its sphere of influence by incorporating it into its customs union, trade union, etc. And in fact, the 2014 invasion was triggered by Ukrainian society's refusal to go along that line. And this commitment in Ukraine has solidified over the last 8 years. So there's really no other option.
Thank you very much, Maria Popova, for this lecture and for your detailed answers. We are really grateful to you and also to all the people who joined us today. I want to tell you that this talk will soon be posted on our YouTube channel, and we'll advertise for it for the recording on social media. And we hope you will be able to share this recording with your friends and colleagues. To find more about the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and our future events, you can visit our website at mcgill.ca/MISC, MISC. You can sign up for our newsletter there, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at MISCCAN, MISCCAN. Those links should now appear on the chat box if you want to copy them. And so once again, thank you very much, Maria. Thanks to all of you. We hope to see you again at one of our other events, virtual or in person here in Montreal. Merci, à la prochaine.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for tuning in.